Your organization is building and updating business-critical web applications faster than ever. And with so much pressure to move fast, you may find yourself making trade-offs between innovation and security. Now you can build fast without sacrificing security with Invicti, the zero-noise application security platform that helps your dev, sec, and ops teams work together to secure every website, web app, and API. With unparalleled accuracy, coverage, and automation, Invicti scales like no other AppSec solution. Invicti, AppSec with zero noise. Visit securityweekly.com/Invicti. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Meets and Ziv about using the Oscar framework to build a map of where attackers target software pipelines and how AppSec teams can respond to that. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella, and it's just about time for the news. But first, an announcement. We're offering the Security Weekly community 20% off InfoSec World 2023 tickets. Join a community of over 2,000 security professionals and innovators at InfoSec World on September 25th through 27th at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort. Experience world-class learning and networking through enlightening keynotes, informative panel discussions, interactive breakout sessions, hands-on workshops, and more. Register today at securityweekly.com/InfoSecWorld 2023 using a code that you'll have to go to that website for in our show notes because it's really long. ISW23-SecWeek20. So if you type fast or have a good memory, good luck. Otherwise, come check out our show notes. The other reason they need to come check out our show notes, John, is because we have a lot of news this week. But I do have a question. Now, this isn't a question from listeners. This is a question from me, and I'm going to put you on the spot. What is the EOL date for Ruby 2.7.7? And while you try and go figure that out by looking at the Ruby Lang website, which I was trying to do myself, we're going to start a timer. See if you figure that out. So good luck. Get going. But the answer is it ends. EOL is coming in 3 weeks and 4 days. Now, have you been able to find what date that is or do the math on the Ruby Lang site?
No, didn't even start.
So the reason I did that is that I'm putting you through the pain live here of the pain that I went through this weekend trying to figure that answer out myself. And I ended up going to endoflife.date, a wonderful website that has all the EOL nicely organized for a ton of different software. And I was very frustrated because March 31st, 2023 is going to be goodbye to Ruby 2.7.7, but I couldn't find on their website an easy way to find their packages. So I think this is maybe a little bit of a rant, a bit of a request that, many packages, many programming languages have a security page, they have news, they have blogs, they have packages. But this one wasn't really discoverable about when is this going away. So that's why I wanted to highlight endoflife.date as a wonderful open source resource.
Wow.
So now, John, so how much time are you spending on this site now?
Yeah, this is a treasure trove of nightmares right here. This is this is super cool find. You know what? It's completely unrelated, but we might as well give it 30 seconds worth of mention. The end of life one that stuck on my mind the last few weeks is Amazon Lambda. I don't know if you've heard about this. So the way Lambda works is they support by default a bunch of, well, not by default, there's a bunch of languages and versions which Amazon supports for Lambda. And really what they've done is they've created the container images already. So when you upload your non-compiled code like a Python or a Node application, it just drops them into that container and they run. Python 3 came out, I think, just about a year ago. And for whatever reason, Amazon hasn't supported this. People have been complaining about it, and then Corey got on the Corey from last week tonight got on last week in AWS, wrong show, got on not the bandwagon, but the Gripe Fest about a week or two ago. And it's been a year and they haven't started supporting the latest Python, and the version they're supporting is about to go EOL. So yeah, but this is a great find. I'm going to bookmark this one.
Yeah, bookmark that one, and definitely a PSA or hopefully a good resource for everyone else to find out not only when is the EOL date coming up, but when was this version released. So it's a great way, just as we talk about, a bit of a callback to our conversation we have with Nietzsche. Lots of organizations are worried about, is this known vulnerability, the CVE? If you can just instill some basic continuous march forward of the latest version, staying on supported versions of software, that builds a lot of muscle memory, if you will, for how to update easily and just have good practices around maintenance. So that's our call to action, I think, and why I wanted to highlight that.
It's probably also great to bring to your management, like, if you're trying to get folks to update software, some of these have pretty good visuals. Like I'm looking at the Ubuntu one, they actually have like a Gantt chart showing like different versions of similarly named operating systems or operating Linux distributions, and like which the support stops and starts for each one. So yeah, this is pretty useful. Cool.
So I think you also mentioned what was it? I think your first reaction was something. This is a page of nightmares because there's a lot of areas of red and things were out of treasure trove. That's what it was. So we also have a treasure trove of a handful of vulns to go through real quick. One was a really fun remote code execution (RCE) on Gitpod. So a cloud-based. I can't speak anymore. A cloud-based and copy IDE environment, a cloud-based IDE. But what was really neat about this is, once again, always a great write-up. We like to highlight those. But this was, I think, the first time we've seen WebSockets as a primary attack vector, or WebSockets being abused through some hijacking and some same origin policy shenanigans to get this. And so I thought I wanted to highlight it from that aspect because we don't see that too often.
Yeah, this was... This somehow snuck by my radar last week. Looks like a fun one. I mean, let's talk about the vuln first so we can go through the side issues around it. As they mentioned in here, usually the WebSockets people, this is sort of similar to the issue we've had with API over the last few years, right? Where people don't scrutinize APIs, at least they didn't used to nearly as much as they needed to. And that started becoming a vector for exploitation and finding vulnerabilities. And, if you think about it from a WebSocket point of view, it's probably a pretty great way to go poking around also, right? Because usually if you're using a WebSocket, you want high availability, but high performance. And usually for most developers, when they start thinking high performance, the words which come to their mind are not security. So there's probably a pretty good number of WebSocket type, WebSockets out there that haven't quite got the careful looky from the security folks. Technical phrase. But yeah, no, I think as they walk through here and as they talk through what's going on in, sort of subverting the same origin policy. And as they say in the beginning, how they found this is they were playing with Burp and seeing what they could get out of this, which is, a fun thing to do with Ace or a new platform. You hop on a new application you start using. But yeah, so the issue itself is pretty interesting in being able to use a cookie at the end to sort of help with that bypass. I think, so where the side issue for me is, or the main issue is, as a development community, we're thinking more and more about using cloud-based IDEs, yeah? Like, this one or whatever, wow, my brain today, GitHub is calling theirs code spaces, or is that visuals? Anyways, the point being that as you do more and more development where you're having to trust someone else, or we've talked enough about SBOM, so I think we know that one. But like now you're going to actually do your software development. Well, you've already gotten used to putting your code onto GitHub or a third-party code repository, plus your CI build somewhere else. Obviously, well, for most of us, you're running the software somewhere else. So now you're actually going to do the actual software development on someone else's machines. So I can see that. I think that got accepted more readily than I expected to. But when you start seeing vulnerabilities like this, that's going to give people a few seconds of thought. So it'll be interesting to see how people respond to this, at least from my point, where I'm standing.
Yeah, indeed. And I like the idea of moving in that direction because from a security perspective, it's nice to have more consistent environments, you can inspect the environments and log from the environments, audit them, do all these wonderful things from a security perspective. But by the same token, you mentioned, looking at WebSockets and being optimized in performance. You also want an IDE to be performant and have a good user experience for the end user. Because if anyone's going to complain about slowness, lack of features, it's going to be developers trying to write their code because that's what they do on a daily basis. And they're going to be sensitive. As sensitive they are to long build times, they're going to be sensitive to the high latency latency or low performance IDEs. But I had another article, John, that was also more about the side issues, actually two about side issues, rather than the attack itself. This one was just really quick about malicious package flood on PyPy. And it's talking about just attackers who were over the weekend uploading hundreds, I think, of malicious packages, basically going after typo squatting. But to me, the message here, the underlying concept is, how do we balance that need for public package repos and also have it in a way that we don't create a burdensome authentication and identity and on all the, let's say, legitimate users who want to bring packages in there? How do we at scale defeat the mass upload of malicious packages without involving people?
Yeah, this one was actually in the thousands. And I thought the number I saw this article says 5,000.
There we go.
I thought I saw an article last week saying 15,000. Maybe that was a separate one with NPM. But either way, we're at the point where you're using bots to generate and upload these packages. I believe they're doing it for crypto mining, if I remember right. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, we're at the point where whichever one of these sites you look at, I mean, Pippi and Node or NPM are the two major ones nowadays. I mean, I guess you've got Chocolatey for C#. These things are, something has to happen. And I know I think we've talked through a few times what the potentials are. Do you get the community to sort of vet each other, or do you do some sort of like a PGP, I can't remember what they call it, but like the ability to do right. The brain really isn't working today. My apologies. But yeah, something has to happen. And I think it was one of the things I listed as my wishes at the end of 2022 for 2023. So I'm not seeing it yet. I don't have any great ideas, but I'm hoping that one of these, I'm sure these folks are thinking about it, but like we're at the point that something has to happen.
Yeah, something has to happen, and something has to happen that is automated. It's a process that doesn't involve just volunteers, because that's going to be just set up to fail. So let me switch to the fact that if your brain's not working, we're going to make that even more painful as we talk about post-quantum encryption, John. Dun, dun, dun. Thank you. Exactly. This is a side channel, however, in an implementation of the Crystal's Kyber, thus my lightsaber reference in the opening. I'm a fan of Crystal's dilithium as well, for those of you who enjoy the Star Trek domain. But this one is neat, and I highlighted it because it was more of the side issue, about the side channel of the implementation. So the algorithm itself is, at least feedback from NIST says, or observations from NIST says, this isn't a flaw in the algorithm that means we need to throw it away. This reference implementation, however, can leak information, which is the type of thing that you don't want to see within any crypto algorithm. One of the other things that I would point out to is that it's fun to talk about, post-quantum attacks or post-quantum safety, things like that. But if we're still working with trying to get people onto TLS 1.3, get them off TLS 1.1, our real world, our near-term considerations are a bit more pressing. So I don't know how you want to take this.
With a heavy dose of sugar. I think you sort of hit something interesting there at the end, because I think, so let's separate those two out. On that second one, the TLS 1.1 folks, they're going to get a pretty rude awakening, guessing 2 to 3 years out as these quantum systems start becoming cheaper to use. There's going to be a point where, as we're seeing right now, as we just said, 5,000 packages being uploaded to Pippi in a weekend or whatever it was, people are going to start snapping TLS encryption like it's a snack. And at some point, we're going to that will resolve itself quite quickly. I think at some point once it hits critical mass. What was interesting to me about this one, in particular, because I think I posted a similar article to you on this one, is that it's not just a side channel attack, but the side channel attack was possible because they're using machine learning to actually identify the signals in the noise. And I think that's, as we start, it's one of the interesting, it's sort of the standard concept of, and I know we were talking about this recently, sort of a bad concept, but the defender has to be right every time, whereas the attacker only needs to be right once. If the attacker doesn't need 100% accuracy, but they're able to get enough out of that machine learning algorithm to identify a key occasionally, that for most attackers will be good enough, right? Not for all, but that it's a very useful tool for both sides of that cyber theater, to say, both with serious and tongue-in-cheek.
Indeed. And we'll have Adrian have to come back on and vet our use of the defenders only have to have, attackers only need to be right once.
Yeah.
So listeners, don't worry. Adrian's a good friend. John, we've been talking about a couple attacks now, and even with the Cloud IDE, that first one, I had mentioned it's really nice. I like the concept, at least, because you have observability. You can look around it. You have logging. We didn't talk about logging specifically in our conversation with Neatson, but logging and auditing is one of those ways to figure out where have I been attacked, or how can I detect that attack. Mm-hmm. And you have a website I wasn't familiar with, another tax site. So tell us about this.
Yeah, this came out after we had a great conversation with Lena last week talking about how incident responders and how incident responders work and how AppSec sort of fits in that equation. And I can't remember how this one got on my radar earlier last week, but yeah, audit logs wall of shame. The question I had asked, I think during our news segment, was, should we charge, or it might have been in the interview, I can't remember, but should we be charging? Well, I don't want to charge for SSO tax, right? I don't think it's ethically right to charge more for different authentication methods or better security on the front side. And my premise was, maybe, I don't have a solid answer at the time, but maybe it might make sense to charge more for enterprisey features like your audit log. And the fine folks at audit-logs.tax do not agree with me, which, okay, cool, I haven't fully thought it through. But what was interesting about the website is they sort of talked through at the beginning, what is an audit log, what should be in an audit log, and then why did they want vendors on this list. So I thought that was interesting, and then how they break down the scoring of them. Does a vendor have log content? Do they do log collection? What's the quality and consistency of the logs? What's in the logs? And then they've got a 10-point scale. So that's there. I think I'm still not. So I guess the question then for me would become, at what point on a 10-point scale would it be okay for a vendor to start charging? And the answer might be 0, like they should never charge. But this is where my brain is now. I'm not fully convinced personally of that, because this is something that someone has to charge for, right? Or someone has to put effort into. It's one thing to be doing audit logs internally for your own systems, but if you're going to be providing audit logs for your customers, which I understand in some cases we need to do, I've done it in previous companies, sign logs, blah, blah. But you're having to store those logs, you're having to provide an API to get to them, you have to have security so that other customers can't access them. There's some amount of cost there for the vendor. So is that built into my product? Or is that something, and then I have to charge all my customers for it, like even the small startup who wants the basic service for $10 a month? Or do I only charge that to the more enterprisey customers? So I don't know. I could see going both ways on this. The audit logs folks are saying no charge period. But I don't know. And it's either way, it's a good site. Mike, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but for me, it's a head scratcher.
Yeah, and I think, again, too, it's one of those things I have to think through before I have my strongly held, uninformed opinion, as any podcaster can have. But more seriously, though, I do like, you kind of touched on this, too, just the idea of what are just good log, what makes a good log? What is good log content as well as collection? And you can infer some of that from a few bullet points on this site. And there is a call out near the bottom to say, hey, share just what are good logs, because speaking internally, any app developer internally should be developing good logs. I think one thing that just comes to mind here is more of, it's one thing to have logs generated. It's another to look at them. And this is possibly in the sense of, some company, if you, the organization, are collecting this information just for your customer and sitting on this, that could just take up a lot of space. There is a cost there, and if no one's consuming that and looking at that, That's unfortunate. So possibly there we're talking about tiers of, well, hold on to your logs for 30 days. Not a great scenario necessarily from a forensics perspective, but if you're not using them, why should we, if a log falls in a forest and nobody does forensics on it, does this analogy even work? I think that's the best I can respond to at the moment.
Yes. And again, I think that maybe that's the case. Maybe if you'll give 15 or 30 days storage for free, but if you want longer than that, then you charge for that. At some point, there's a cost. And that's, I think, where we're both sort of going, where is that sort of fine point?
Yeah. In a less fine point, this was something that I alluded to a little bit in our conversation with Nietzsche talking about OWASP top 10 lists. But of course, the focus there was to talk about the Oscar framework. But there's been a conversation that we've picked up on a little bit over the last couple of episodes, especially Akira's mentioned this too, about OWASP and its direction. And here's another kind of open letter comment or article from LinkedIn, or somebody posted on LinkedIn about the evolution of OWASP. And one thing that stood out to me that I really liked is two things, I suppose. One, the nature of the discussion. Should we be like the OpenSSF? Probably not, because different types of communities, perhaps. But I also like pointing to the cheat sheet series. I, for the longest time, have been kind of unexcited about the OWASP top 10 lists, other than just a nice way of putting together terminology for awareness. But cheat sheet series, I do like those because they're a little bit more actionable. And even mentioned the Kubernetes one last episode. And but I think one of the questions is, and if this is going to be our thinking hats on episode, John, is where should OWASP be going, or what should they look like in the future?
Yes. Excuse me. Oh, you got me. With my brain sleeping instead of thinking. So the quick recap for folks playing along at home, if you're not listening to each and every episode of Application Security Weekly, is I believe it was originally Mark Curfew, wasn't it, who
Yes.
wrote the initial open letter about, as he was running for office again, for being part of the board for OWASP. And then that got turned into an open letter, OWASP-change on GitHub, which has now a growing list of signatories on it. And from these, the point was to do a really high-level TLDR is OWASP needs to change. We can't have the same organization that we had when this thing was created many, many years ago. And is it responding to the environment? How do we need to fund it? And where do we need to focus? I think they've got 5 points, but I'm going to sort of hand wave my way through it there. Let's see here quickly. It should be a community plan, governance structure, funding, improved infrastructure, and then active management from of the portfolios and local chapters. Okay, cool. And so where we're going with this is we had a fine fellow, John Stephen, wrote another open letter. He just had to publish his on LinkedIn. But it's sort of going through, and his point of view is, at least from what I took away from it, Mike, was he doesn't want, or he feels you shouldn't have really tight structure over an organization like OWASP with a plan and things like that, because the lack of that plan is what allows projects to sort of instantiate and grow organically. And if they're successful, they become very big and popular, like ZAP. Or if not, they're one of the other cheat sheets, which we haven't talked about for 5 years. I think the biggest point I agree with from him, I want to cover this on the show. I don't want to take sides on this. I want to sort of have it open for the community and not have us sort of talking about it. That's my point of view. But the one point which I think we talked about when we talked about this last time, the request for a budget on the scale which they were looking for gave me a moment of pause, just because it's not easy to raise that money. Not impossible, but and that was sort of one of his points too, I think. But that's where the ball's at right now in the field. I don't know. Any questions or any thoughts on that, Mike?
Yeah, and I think this is an area too. We'd love to hear some, feedback,
Yes.
observations, comments from listeners as well, just to get a sense of the community. What are the perspectives you're coming into as you see this discussion? For me, one of the things to reinforce your point you were making about a little bit of call it lack of structure or fostering a structureless or flexible environment is the community, is that John Stevens does point out that right now they've seen a lot of contributors who didn't necessarily have big names being able to come in and make names for themselves, whether it is in a project or specifically, or it's on the education aspect, or it's really just fostering community. And perhaps this is an area that OWASP could use that budget, could lean into more in the sense of local chapters fostering community, and they focus on that aspect for AppSec practitioners as opposed to perhaps focusing on developer-oriented solutions. So I still haven't thought through all of these things myself about what the implications here. But I think if I were to try to summarize it, it also feels like OWASP does need to figure out who's their primary audience in the sense of AppSec people, and avoiding too much of just presenting the latest cross, WebSocket hijacking, the coolest server-side prototype pollution to other AppSec practitioners, or opening that up to the development world as well, and actually saying, AppSec is seeing these problems, but developers are the ones that really need to work on them. Maybe we should have better outreach, more community with developers as opposed to OWASP, AppSec folks.
I was about to go down that same path as you, from the point of view of who is that target audience for OWASP? I think it's actually the AppSec people, but you're not. The thing is, you're not preaching to that choir. What you're doing is you're providing a space for that choir to figure out how to sing to everyone outside the room, if I can use that analogy. And I think that's, I don't know, as you were talking through, I mean, if I think about what I've seen at CNCF or Apache or any of these other foundations, anyone can come, at least in any of the spaces I've been in, anyone's been able to come along and have an interest in something and say, hey, let's work on this. And it's usually greeted warmly. So I don't know if money is needed there. I mean, money might be needed to help give them the resources to make that go somewhere. Yeah, I don't know. I'm curious to see where this goes. Obviously, we're now seeing, it's good that we're seeing more than one point of view on it. I want to see multiple point of views and have that conversation in public, which is what sounds like what's going to happen. So the next few months should be interesting to sort of watch and see where this goes, or hopefully it stays polite and open-minded.
Indeed. And I think we'll continue these conversations as we see more voices in the community with influence too, have these comments and try to figure out and try to help translate them well, which you've helped us do with this particular article as well, John. The other thing you can help us do is some listeners may not realize that John also occasionally hops over to Business Security Weekly, Enterprise Security Weekly, even though Application Security Weekly starts with A and comes first in our hearts as well as the alphabet. But in the spirit of that, you also wanted to talk about another semi-third rail, another interesting topic here, John, that can get lots of opinions about software liability.
Yes, I promise I'm just dipping my toe in ESW and BSW. I'm here. Yeah, and like I said, so this is an article which could fit very nicely into either of those two shows. So it's on a website, Lawfare, doesn't even sound right to say, lawfareblog.com. And the title of the article is Cybersecurity's Third Rail, Software Liability. And it's written by a lawyer. And he's talking about something which we haven't mentioned on this show yesterday, which is sort of impressive, which is the Biden administration. I'm actually going to forget because I haven't been looking at that closely. But the National Cybersecurity Strategy was published last week. I remember it's a 35-page PDF. But the reason I brought this in here for this community of listeners, which we appreciate all of you, like and subscribe, is to think through, what's the result of what we're doing, or how do we, as these things come down the road, we talk about SBOM and we side-eye some time and all those type of things. But let's see, there was one or two phrases in here. Excuse me, I had it in my notes. As each of your organizations, for folks out there listening here, either application security folks or developers, software developers or management, whoever else, one of the concepts they have, it's a legal concept, but it's mentioned in this article, the standard of care around application security. So basically the point of this strategic document coming out is saying that the software developers and the vendors are going to have to start thinking about what is the standard of care which we are going to put into our software so that when we publish or release something, it's trustworthy and it is something that people can use. And also if something happens, if our standard of care is not acceptable, or if it's too low, or we're basically shrugging it off, there's going to be repercussions, right? That's sort of where it's going. Excuse me. But let's see, there was one phrase in there also that, the example of what he sort of talks through in this is he talks through, I believe it's in the 70s here in the US, the car manufacturers started getting the eye from the government. And there was too many crashes in cars where, like, they weren't really being developed with with physical security in mind, right? From a crash point of view, and no seatbelts. And, many of us have seen like the stories of the Ford Pinto for many years was a joke in movies of like you hit it from the back end and it explode. And basically the government started pushing on the automobile manufacturers, guys, you got to step up your game. And the response they were getting back was, look, this is from the automobile manufacturers. We're not selling the cars to the general public, so the general public can't sue us, can't go to court with us. We're selling the cars to the local dealership, and then they get to sell it or do what they want with it. So the general public should be suing the car dealership, not the manufacturers. And then their second argument was, we're not building cars, we're just assembling a bunch of parts, right? We don't build the tires or the wheels or the brakes, or we don't put gas in it. These are all coming from different places, so obviously it's not our problem. Sounds sort of familiar with SBOM, huh? And so it was an interesting analogy, something to think about. It's just sort of a different point of view, obviously very non-technical. But, something's coming down the road. And I think most of us on this show are aware of it, or who are listening to this show. But the question comes, how do we actually implement this in a way which is, what's that standard of care? How much trouble do we go to? We're not looking for perfect security. But at the same time, we have to make sure that we've got a standard of care. So that's why I added that in there.
Wonderful summary and an overview of that topic. I think the only thing I can add is just kind of bits of trivia to support that direction that you were describing. Is we've seen both in the UK as well as the US IoT regulations coming out of what some of that standard of care might look like, in the sense of no default password, being able to, you'll have a minimum duration of support for the device, as well as I believe encryption as well, the use of TLS. So we've seen these in small technical points, but I think you're highlighting rightly. There's a much larger issue here when we talk about money and liability.
Yes, and I'm going to grab that segue, whether you meant it or not, and mention an article I threw in here also from Security Week. Wago PLC, I believe it's a German company. They've got a bunch of critical vulnerabilities. None of them are worth talking about because all your standard stuff like remote code execution, cross-site scripting, complete lack of authentication on some of their admin interfaces. But the reason I added this in here, besides sort of that sort of IoT stuff, which should be done better, the thought crossed my mind when I was reading it. Are we going to start finding these things cheaper on eBay? So, and I'm not saying this snarkily, I mean this seriously. As a hobby community, those of us who are interested in IoT or whatever else, if a brand or either a home platform like an internet router or a Wi-Fi router or a PLC like this, if these things start getting a reputation for being vulnerable, either certain models or certain vendors, are we going to start finding cheap toys to play with on the secondhand market? And that's good and bad. As a home gamer, we suddenly start having things to play with in our labs, or things to use around our house if we're going to put them on a separate network and DMZ them and all that type of thing. But I thought that was sort of an interesting thing to think about, and I haven't searched eBay yet, so it might be worth doing a little bit of research on this. But
It's a great point, and that's where, if you look at like DEF CON Black Hat type of presentations in the hardware space, a lot of people do go to, I found this on eBay, and it could be quite surprising what they do find on eBay, especially from the military surplus environments or law enforcement surplus. So yeah, we'll keep an eye out on there, and not an area that I have expertise in. So this is why we're glad to have you looking into these hardware types of fun, John. I think one real quick, just to wrap up, mentioning OWASP, I wanted to highlight ZAP, Zed Attack Proxy, as a OWASP project, and it's kind of one of my tools of the week that I wanted to show off. It's the other web proxy that is useful to bug bounty researchers, pen testers, even just debugging HTTP traffic. And it also does, of course, have WebSocket support. So you could even be using it if you're going to poke around something like the cloud-based IDEs, or we skipped over the article, but there was another article about OAuth misconfigurations and taking a look at redirect variables in URIs. So ZAP, great tool, great project, the type of thing that hopefully OWASP would continue to support and center and invest in is the word I'm going for. Not sure if there's anything you want to add there, if ZAP has been used recently in your life there, John.
It's weird. I've always been a burp guy.
Yeah, we see bug bounty write-ups, we see articles, they always mention burp, and Portswigger has wonderful resources, but
this is a great tool. I've got nothing against it. I'm sure I've used it at some point, but I guess it's just habit, right? When you go looking in your bag of tools, your favorites you've got, like in your little sort of, you got the tools in the garage and you got the stuff you carry with you, or at least me. And if I'm going reaching for something quickly to sniff, I go looking for burp, but I've got nothing against this. It's a great tool.
Yeah, and actually, speaking of burp and Portswigger, they are shutting down their daily swig, their AppSec news. Unfortunately, that was one of my go-to resources for AppSec news of the week for us. So thank you to Portswigger and crew for putting together, doing great, not only just a list of articles, but actual journalism behind them. That was always what was really helpful. So they're doing a good thing, trying to treat their people right, and giving them opportunities to find other opportunities within the Portswigger company. But thank you for all that work.
Well, I guess this means this will be the last episode of Application Security Weekly News, since we're not going. No, I'm kidding. I'm sure it's what's happening with you too, Mike. Like, they've had so much good stuff coming out of there for the last few months that I've stopped posting their articles because it felt like every week there was like talking about ZAP or burp. They had one just in the last week or two about creating. I think it's a plugin they have, creating diagrams to show traffic patterns going back and forth by using burp. I mean, they've always got amazing stuff. So thank you guys for everything you've done. It's amazing. I'm even without this show, I'm very bummed. That was a great place to go look at stuff.
It is, and great journalistic voice too. They're always really fun. Yeah. Luckily, though, John, I think we can keep going for another couple of weeks. There will be vulns and breaches that will come out, so we can cover. I don't think we'll be replaced by artificial intelligence anytime soon. So no ChatGPT co-host. So we're both safe here. But I did find to close this out, a little bit older article from NIST has an AI risk management framework, and mostly I wanted to highlight this as a way to talk about ChatGPT without talking about ChatGPT, because it's kind of like the new shiny thing, but mostly shallow from a lot of what I've seen. But at least this framework is a nice step towards having a shared language and a shared framing of how do we talk about risk. And just real quickly, it starts off with that framing, as I put it, or as they put it, is the harm to people, the harm to an organization, as well as the harm to ecosystems. So that could be, especially with the ecosystems, touches a little bit on like the package management repos or things like that. What is the impact of this onto areas that we wouldn't expect? The last episode, I had a reference in my back pocket to impact of AI on Clark's World magazine. This is a science fiction magazine that was receiving a whole bunch of submissions generated by artificial intelligence. Yeah. And they had to ban a whole bunch of people for plagiarism and because of this. But here is a small corner of the web that I happen to pay attention to, many others do, getting submissions of sci-fi short stories, but just being overwhelmed by stories written by AI that was just creating a bunch of noise and distraction for them. So that's one example too. I just wanted to highlight of what it looks like on ecosystems, well away from anything we usually talk about when we think of AppSec, InfoSec. And I'll let you take us out on this one.
Oh boy, I've missed this article. I'm quickly flicking through 48 pages of PDF.
Good luck.
It looks like a good read actually. I'm going to go back and read after this. So the one thing I think I'll take us out on is, remember, listeners, when we talk about these things, we're always looking for your feedback and comments and hop on Discord and all those type of things, but leave us out of this. Anytime you hear us talk about OWASP or NIST or any of these organizations, and NIST, yes, is a U.S. government organization, they'll still take volunteers, most of these groups. So if you want to contribute to these things or if you have thoughts around these areas, always goes to these websites and looking how to join these communities. Everyone's looking for help, right? It's not just we know it's a tight job market for us cyber types out there, but even on the open source side or on the community, how these documents are created and generated, it's not just like 2 or 3 scientists sitting this in an office somewhere in Bethesda, right? It's in Maryland. It's the community which is actually saying, hey, we put some time and thinking into this, or even if you haven't, right? With CSA, frequently we'll get folks who they might not know too much about cloud security, but they're very interested in it. They'll get in, they'll start doing the research and become part of a working group. So find one of these areas which interest you, and go and help folks out and help the community and learn more yourself and sort of mentor other people. That's what I'll leave you with.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Please do subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes, and speaking of things to be interested in, check out Nemesis by Mitch Murder. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.